Tell us about your book and why you wrote it now.
Well, that book has been some time in the making. I wrote it for three reasons, basically. First, because I felt the level of knowledge of the EU and its mechanisms and operations, institutions and practices in this country is not particularly strong. It leaves a lot to be desired. People have got the most peculiar views about the EU and what it is. So I thought I should offer a bit of clarity on that. Second reason why I did it, was because I wanted to offer a coherent argument to the left. Not just the left in this country, but the left in Europe, because I find that the left has got the most extraordinary views about the EU and refuses to confront EU reality as it is. It sort of created an image, a dream image of the EU. The third reason why I wrote it is because I wanted to convey something, the flavor of my experience with Syriza and what it attempted to do 3 years ago when the first Syriza government was elected in Greece, which collapsed in complete failure. I wanted to convey some of that, and I wanted to indicate what this shows to us about the EU.
Is there a frustration on your part over the left's fixation on the sentimental narrative of the EU, over the cold realities of what it does and what it's doing and what it wants to do going forward?
Frustration is not the word. There's frustration, amazement, anger, disbelief, and just in a sense awe at the doggedness of some extraordinary beliefs about the EU, the persistence of these beliefs among the left. It's a new development, incidentally, across Europe, and certainly in this country, where the left used to be very, very Eurosceptic. When I first came to live in this country 40 years ago, I remember well the British left had a very strong Eurosceptic contingent, which was radical and healthy, and now it doesn't. Or at least it's not as vocal. So I am frustrated, I am amazed by what the left argues about the EU, because he has created a completely imaginary picture of the EU compared to what that institution is. It's taken an institution created by nation states, an institution that basically promotes the interests of nation states through transnational organizations, and in this way promotes the interests of capital against labor. It's taken that institution and transformed it into somehow an institution of solidarity, peace, fraternity and progress among European nations that would be in the interest of working people. It's just utopian, nothing to do with the reality of it, and that's what I wanted to bring out in the book. I think there's also a further dimension to the obsession of the left with the European Union. I think it has to do with the loss of confidence by the left in its own ideas and in its ability to change economies and societies in Europe and more broadly. I think the left has stopped believing that it can challenge capitalism effectively. It has stopped believing that an alternative way of running society is possible, a socialist way is possible, or at least large sections of the left have stopped believing that, really believing in it. And their view is that basically capitalism is the only effective way, the only realistic way, and therefore it's got to be accepted and tweaked, improved, ameliorated. Accepting the European Union is part and parcel of this attitude by the left, I think, and I find that deeply problematic because the left ought to be about challenging capitalism, challenging its institutions in Europe, and proposing different alternative ways of running the world to ordinary people.
On the euro, this was largely driven by France, post-German reunification, as a means of sort of keeping a leash on Germany. How has that worked out for Europe, and particularly the periphery?
The monetary union, first of all, is the backbone of the EU. That has to be said, because people in this country don't appreciate that very often, because Britain, luckily, fortunately for it, has never been in the monetary union. But the euro is the backbone of the EU in crucial ways. So one has to decide to discuss the euro while discussing the EU. The euro was a strange creation from its very beginning, and it remains a very strange creation. It was created politically, fundamentally by the French. The French pushed for it. The Germans were not that openly keen to have it. There were debates, obviously, but the French pushed for it. And to my mind, the political calculation was fairly clear. Germany was about to be reunified, and the outcomes would be unpredictable on the continent. So the calculation of the part of the French elite was, let's create political and economic and monetary mechanism that will tie Germany in, that will prevent Germany from repeating some of the historical experiences of the past. Obviously, there were narrowly economic factors at play as well, exchange rate instability and so on, but the politics, I think, was of this type. It's the biggest miscalculation of the century as far as France is concerned, or at least one of the biggest miscalculations of the century, because of course that's not how things have turned out. The euro has rebounded in the interests of German big business, particularly German exporting industrial capital, tremendously in favor of that section of the European economy. It's the only section that has benefited clearly from the euro, and that has given Germany the upper hand in dealing with the rest of the monetary union and with the rest of the European Union. Germany has emerged as the hegemonic power of Europe through the monetary union. There is no question at all about it, and all you've got to do is look at the behavior of President Macron, who comes to power thinking that he's going to transform Europe, that he has all these very nice ideas, makes all these proposals, imagining that somehow he's on a par with Berlin. And then in the course of 1 year, realizing that no, he's not on a par with Berlin. Until Berlin speaks, nothing will happen in Europe. And not only this, but Macron is also facing tremendous discontent among his own people, because of course France cannot live with Germany economically, and it's losing out politically.
What did the Eurozone crisis tell us about the EU, especially with regard to Greece and to a lesser degree Cyprus?
The Eurozone crisis was, for me, a defining moment or a defining period in the history of the European Union. When the crisis emerged, it was obvious to me and to several others that this was a systemic crisis that had to do with the very structure of the European Union and the monetary union. This wasn't obvious to the functionaries and others of the European Union, I hasten to add. Eventually, though, it became clear that it is a systemic problem, not just a problem of Greeks not managing their economy well, or Cypriots, or the Irish, or whoever else. So at that time, I thought there is a chance, possibly, that the administration and the people who run the union would begin to bring changes to bear that will alter things and somehow rebalance it. I thought they would see sense. Sense in that context for me meant asking and demanding that the core of the European Union, Germany in particular, rebalance its own economy and create conditions for greater harmony across the Union. Well, you know, how wrong can you be? Nothing, not a jot of that. No impositions were made on Germany or on the core in general. Everything was imposed on the stricken peripheral countries, and of course Greece being the main one, the country of experiments, let's call it that. And the behavior of the European Union in relation to Greece was abominable. That is not to detract from the weaknesses of Greek capitalism, the Greek state, the Greek elite, the Greek bourgeoisie, call it what you like. I can be very, very vociferous about these people, but that's not to detract from them. But looking at the European Union, the behavior towards Greece was unbelievable. There's no other way to describe it. Arrogant, domineering, not caring about the implications of policies they were proposing, keen to protect narrow interests of very particular economic sectors of the core, and imposing on the country policies and practices that guarantee the historic marginalization of Greece. In the course of doing that, they showed complete disregard for democracy. They bypassed democracy completely, disregard for what the Greek people wanted. and impose their own will on the country and its practices. A kind of neo-colony emerged in Greece, run by the European Union in openly undemocratic ways. For many people it was a revelation. When it comes to Cyprus in particular, where we had elements of this, although the Cypriot crisis was not as deep as the Greek crisis, what we also saw there was that the European Union was prepared to take ordinary people's money out of their pockets in order to save the banks. And that's how they solved the problem. They basically imposed haircuts on lots of savers. They stole their money, basically, and rescued the banks. So in that respect, too, the European Union showed what, in truth, it is about. So that all is clear, it seems to me, and economists and historians and others understand it. What is remarkable is that the left refuses to draw the right lesson out of it. It still is doggedly refusing to draw the right lesson out of it, to recognize the European Union for what it is, and to recognize what kind of attitude is necessary in order to confront it.
The British left are very fond of the EU and generally seem to feel it's an ally against a rapacious neoliberal orthodoxy. To what extent do you consider the EU, the single market, the Stability and Growth Pact, etc., fits that description?
Well, how wrong can you be? I mean, how mistaken can you be? The European Union, since Maastricht at least, the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 and everything that led to it and everything that followed from it, is actually in some ways an example, a paradigm of neoliberalism in practice. That's what has happened to the Union. It has become, in a sense, institutionalized, embedded neoliberalism. That's what it is, and that's how it functions. You can see that in terms of the core logic of it, the famous four freedoms of capital, of labor, of goods and services, which are interpreted as individual freedoms by European law, and therefore act as powerful levers of neoliberalism, the imposition of neoliberalism across the Union. And these are made practice, made real, enforced by the European Court of Justice. So you have a huge structure of law and a very powerful institution, a very peculiar institution, the European Court of Justice, that makes sure that neoliberalism rules. In addition to that, you've got a whole host of other institutions, the Council, Parliament, but a whole raft of economic institutions as well, the European Central Bank, the Eurogroup, you name it. There's a whole range of institutions which do precisely this, ensure that neoliberal practices and neoliberal ideology rules the roost. This is a thoroughly neoliberal juggernaut. That's what it is. And in an embedded way. It's not as if it's a political choice that could be changed tomorrow. This has become institutional reality and institutional practice. The thought that this could be used to fight neoliberalism and defend the interests of working people against big business across the world is so ludicrous. I mean, Brussels is one of the main lobby points for big business. That's how Brussels works. And the idea that this outfit could be used to defend the interests of working people doesn't bear scrutiny for a second, never mind serious debate. Equally, I would argue, the idea that this body of institutions, this set of institutions could be reformed in the interest of working people shows an unwillingness to recognize what is what, to confront what is what straight in the face, and to be materialist and practical about things.
During the referendum, many on the left sort of acknowledged the shortcomings of the EU. Some of them advocating leave. The majority adopted a remain and reform position. How credible is the prospect of serious reform of the EU from the bottom up?
Let me first of all say that the remain and reform position has always baffled me deeply for a number of reasons, and I can mention two immediately. The first is sort of more in terms of the logic of it, because those who advocate it usually say there is nothing that the left in this country would want to do which it cannot do as the EU currently stands. And you can get into involved arguments about state aid, about public procurement, about nationalization. You can show that these things exist in the EU, and therefore you get into involved arguments by the supporters of this view who say, why leave? We can bring to bear a radical program such as the Labour Party proposed in its manifesto in 2017. Therefore, it doesn't stop us from doing anything. And then, almost in the same breath, the argument is, therefore, let's remain and reform. And the question is, reform what? If you can do everything you like, if presumably you can apply all the policies that you wanted to apply, and it doesn't stop you from being radical, why reform? I mean, why engage in reform? The mere fact that you're talking about reform indicates that there are things that you cannot do, that this institution is stopping you from doing things, it's preventing you from doing things. If one starts from that, then one will discover very difficult things about the European Union. The other thing I've got to say about Remain and Reform is that, of course, he has been tested. There's nothing new about it. It's been tested, it's been tried, and it's been found profoundly wanting. This is precisely the strategy that Syriza employed in Greece in 2015. That was exactly the strategy that the leadership of Syriza deployed at that time. The idea was, we go to the European Union, we declare our determination to stay in the monetary union, never mind in the European Union. Of course we'll stay in. But because we've got democratic legitimacy, because we've been elected by the Greek people, and because we've got a good program and good ideas, we will put our case across. Our case will be accepted, we will win concessions, and in this way we will start and catalyze a process of transformation from within, and the European Union will become gradually something else. It will improve and it will move in the interest of working people. This was believed by large numbers of Syriza supporters, the cadre, the membership, the leadership at the time. Not all of it, because people like me and others did not, but the majority. So it was tried immediately, and he came to an ignominious end immediately. It didn't fail 6 or 7 months later when Syriza eventually surrendered. It failed immediately the minute it was tried. The minute that the Syriza delegation, the first Syriza delegation, confronted the European Union, it realized what it had opposite to it. It had a body facing it that was unbending, unyielding, arrogant, confident in what he wanted, and certainly not above blackmail. And they were trounced. They were completely trounced, following which they basically procrastinated for 6 or 7 months, and in the end they surrendered without gaining a single not one concession from the European Union. The strategy was tried and it came to an end, ignominiously. Now, one might say Britain is a bigger country and we're not in the European Monetary Union, we're in the European Union. Therefore, as a bigger country, not with the euro, we have better chances. Well, I'll tell you, if that's what you think, you're misled and you're believing in your own arguments, basically. You're not testing your own arguments against reality. Because the opposition you're going to face is of the same quality as the Greeks faced 3 years ago. And this has become clear in the 2 years of negotiating with them. They will give no quarter to a radical government. They will not give it any breathing space, and they will stop it from applying any kind of radical measures to the degree to which they can. And they've got means. They've got means and ways. The idea of staying in the European Union and reforming it in a pro-Labour direction is the definition of utopianism, as far as I'm concerned.
There seems to be a very casual disregard for basic democratic norms in regards to the left's approach to the EU during the sort of Brexit debates here. Has that surprised you?
The European Union has a long history of a democratic deficit, so-called. This is a well-known thing. It's been discussed in academic literature and by various political theorists and others over many years. It's not a new thing. It is well known that the structures created in Europe do not allow for an easily recognizable expression of the democratic will of the European people. It's heavily mediated by a whole raft of organizations that do all sorts of things to popular will as it passes through them. So it's well known that there is a democratic deficit. But I've got to say that what has happened the last couple of decades is an enormous widening of this deficit in the most unprecedented way. And I'll give you two examples of it, just to indicate the content of this. The first is fundamentally that economic policy, which is by far and away the most important policy of a modern government, certainly the backbone of a policy by a modern government, has been depoliticized. It has gradually become an issue over which a democratic vote means very little. And you can see that by simply considering the Syriza government in Greece and the Salvini government in Italy, from the opposite ends of the political spectrum. The Syriza government was left-wing government 3 years ago. The Salvini government, coalition government, I know it's not the Salvini government, but Salvini is the main man in the Italian government. It comes from the other side of the political spectrum. Different policies, different outlook, different economic analysis, presumably. Both of them have been told by the European Union, you can believe whatever you like, in the end you will have to follow the policies imposed by the Union as a whole. You have to comply. And that is presented as economic sense, economic realism. Well, then the question easily arises, why vote? What is the point of voting? What's the point of submitting economic plans to the electorate and seeking the electorate's support? What's the point of the Italians voting for one party, the Greeks voting for another, if both will have to do the same thing in the end, because that's what the union dictates. That's the depoliticization of economics that I mentioned before, and that's the hollowing out of democracy. Ordinary people know that. They understand it. I mean, it might appear as a triumph of sense, of technocratic sense, of the people who know, of the various specialists who populate the pages of the newspapers. But ordinary people understand it as powerlessness. They understand it as loss of democratic capabilities. They understand it as hopelessness and frustration, and that leads to the various phenomena that we observe across Europe, the rejection of the European Union and the strengthening of the right, because it's the right that's making that point. Second example I want to give you is more concrete, and it has to do with how the European Union intervenes when its fundamental interests are challenged. We all know that referenda are practices in which the European Union specializes, especially in repeating them. So you vote one time, if you don't get the right result as far as Brussels is concerned, you vote again until you get the result that Brussels wants. Britain might experience a bit of that in the coming period if things work out in a certain way. But it's actually worse than that as well. What we saw in the course of the Eurozone crisis is that Brussels was not above, or more accurately, the Council of Ministers, which is where power lies, was not above appointing governments which were unelected. Overthrowing elected governments or sidelining elected governments in Greece and also in Italy, and appointing prime ministers who were not elected but were prepared to apply the policies that the European Union considered to be the preferred policies for the country in question. That is an immediate sidelining of democracy, and that again is understood by ordinary people. So democracy and the European Union do not go together in these concrete ways that are mentioned.
Free movement is talked about here in terms of individual rights, our ability to travel and live where we want. How does the EU interpret free movement, and particularly the ECJ, with regard to balancing personal versus corporate rights?
I think this is a very important and touchy issue for obvious reasons, because it makes a lot of people in this country think that opposing the EU has to do with racism and anti-immigrant policies and so on. And there's no doubt that people on the far right often do advocate positions of this type. But people on the left do not. It's perfectly possible to oppose the European Union without actually falling into that trap in the slightest. And for that, one has to be clear about how the European Union itself understands the right of free movement. And to remember that the right of labor to move, internationalism as far as labor is concerned, is not the same thing from the standpoint of labor as it is from the standpoint of capital. And the EU, by and large, adopts the standpoint of capital, of big business. Internationalism of labor, free movement of labor for big business, is essentially the right of big business to employ labor on the worst possible conditions across borders, to shift labor across borders, and to benefit and profit out of these disparities created. And the European Union has passed legislation allowing this, with posted workers and so on, facilitating precisely this practice. And that is precisely for the reason mentioned, that they are interpreted as individual rights, which in effect rebound as corporate rights. The left should oppose that. That is not left-wing internationalism, that is not labor internationalism, that is not workers' internationalism in the slightest. People do have a right to move across borders, of course, and people were not for closed borders, were not for opposing immigration lock, stock and barrel, far from it, but there are conditions, terms and so on. People have to move in a safe way, with reasonable jobs, with good conditions of employment and places to stay, and they've got to have conditions to integrate with the local community, and the local community also has to be protected. It is very important that the rights of the incumbents are also protected. That is labor internationalism. That is how it's always been understood by trade unions, who have always been in the forefront of defending workers' rights, even if they are coming from abroad, or if they are workers who already live in a certain country. There is a long tradition of workers' internationalism, which it seems that large parts of the left have forgotten, and they have fallen for this business internationalism, capitalist internationalism, that is basically EU internationalism. The two are very, very different. We should have nothing to do with the internationalism of big business.
Many young Corbynites are quite zealous Remainers. Is there a tension, as you see it, between the sort of politics that Corbyn espouses and membership of the EU?
There is a profound tension, deep tension. And I think the leadership of the Labour Party understands this tension, and that creates the political difficulties they're faced with, because of course large numbers of the Labour Party membership, but also the people who vote for the Labour Party, do not see it, and they're in favour of Remain. There's no question about it. Let me put it to you in concrete terms, because it's a good opportunity to do so. The radical program of the Labour Party, as we saw it in the manifesto in 2017, and the even more radical program, which in my belief and in my view the Labour Party will need in the next election, it needs to go beyond the 2017 manifesto. That radical program that the Labour Party must propose to the country is simply not doable within the EU, and it's not difficult to see why. Britain needs an industrial strategy. It needs a profound industrial strategy, and the Labour Party knows it. It needs to rebalance its economy between manufacturing, industry and services. It needs to lessen the weight of the bloated service sector and to lessen the weight of the City of London. It needs to definancialise and strengthen, as I said, the secondary sector. The industrial strategy that it needs for that must be targeted, focused and well organised. For that you need state aid, you need to target public procurement, you need to organise credit and banking in order to support it, and you need to do so in a radical way. Now, I understand it is possible to have state aid, and it is possible to have public procurement use and even credit mobilization in the European Union, but everything, all of that within the context of competition. It must comply with competition. This is a neoliberal institution, as I mentioned, which imposes severe restraints on how you can intervene in these fields, and actually it's more restrictive than even the WTO regulations. A lot of people don't appreciate that. WTO regulations are more permissive when it comes to state aid and public procurement than EU regulations. So for Corbyn to adopt the industrial strategy that the country needs and the Labour Party members want, it is imperative that a new framework is sought, a framework that is beyond the European Union, to break with the European Union. And that is even before starting to talk about the redistribution that this country needs, the profound change in distribution of income and wealth that it needs, and of course the change in trading practices that it needs to rebalance its trade with Europe and the rest of the world. Very little of that is possible within the European Union in the way that the left government would want. So the Labour Party wants a radical strategy, as it should. If he wishes to change, to transform British society as it should, then it should be in favour of Brexit. And that, to me, is the true meaning of Brexit. That's really the only Brexit that makes sense, and it's the only Brexit that's doable. The only Brexit that is coherent and the British people want.
The EU is struggling in economic terms, as well as facing increasing cultural fractures, both in some of its western states, but also more prominently with the Visegrad nations. Where do you see the EU in 10 years' time?
Well, the EU faces at the moment what I think is an existential crisis. And clearly it faces tensions with some of the peripheral groupings within it, Central European periphery, but also the southern periphery in the Mediterranean, and other groupings, the Baltic periphery and so on. It faces tensions with those, but the biggest tension that I see is in the core. The true measure of instability and the potential crisis in the EU is apparent in the core. You only have to look at Italy and France. That's where the real danger is. Italy is stagnant, it's dead on its feet. And as long as it complies with the economic policies dictated by the European Union, it will not grow. It's very difficult to see how it will get out of the trap in which it is. But equally severe is the predicament of France, as it has become very clear in the last few weeks, because France cannot compete with Germany. It's continually out-competed by Germany. And if it tries to adopt German-style policies, it will fail, as President Macron has just realized. This is wrong-headed, it's the wrong way to go. It is trying to imitate Germany when Germany has got a lead in this and you cannot catch up with it, and it is attacking ordinary people in France who are rebelling against it. So France is in deep trouble when it comes to its relation with Germany, and therefore the entire core of the European Union is in deep trouble. Now, if you combine it with the democratic deficit that I mentioned, and if you combine it with the discontent from east to west among ordinary people with the powerlessness, the loss of popular sovereignty, the perception of the frustration and so on, you can see the Union is in a very difficult position. Where will it go and what will happen? Institutions tend to persist in the capitalist world for a long time, although the content changes. They might retain the name, but they become something else as time unfolds. I cannot see the monetary union surviving for the indefinite future. That I cannot see. The monetary union is a terrible failure, and the next crisis, whenever that happens, the next global outbreak of instability will probably be the end of the monetary union. The European Union as a whole will probably survive after that, but it will be something very different to what it is at the moment. It will probably be some kind of loose alliance, some kind of an empty shell, basically. That's the most likely thing. Things gonna happen in the future. What is for sure is that the years of confidence, of onwards and upwards movement that we saw in the late 80s and early 90s, the years that brought Maastricht and so on, they are not going to come back. That they're finished. They led to a disaster. They're finished. And from now on, it's a question of managing decline and managing instability. Whatever it is, whichever way it goes, the crucial thing here is for the European left to get its act together. And as this outfit is coming to its inevitable historical end, propose something radical, progressive, and forward-looking to the European people, because if it doesn't, then the political outcomes will not be very good at all.